world that the international community and their own leaders had forgotten the Palestinian people and expelled from their lands. In 1954, a small group of Palestinians who believed that the liberation of their homeland had come in order for Arab unity to be achieved took the name of Fatah, Arabic for conquest. The organization was led by Yasser Arafat, Khilal al-Wazir, and Salah Khalif. In 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was established to represent the Palestinians in their search for a return of their occupied lands in Israel, forming an umbrella under which the resistance groups such as Fatah could operate. In 1969, following the disastrous War for the Arabs, the leadership of the PLO was taken over by Yasser Arafat, a man who had done more than any other to bring the Palestinian cause to the eyes of the world. Arafat came under criticism for abroad as head of the PLO because he either condoned the violence of Palestinian resistance groups on Israel or was unable to stop it. Despite that, the PLO was given a tremendous boost in 1974 when it was recognized as the sole representative of the Palestinian people by the Arab League. Later after that, Arafat himself took the podium of the UN in New York to address the General Assembly at the PLO was granted observer status by the United Nations organization. With his gun holster empty, Arafat urged the UN to help the Palestinians regain their land, saying, "I have come bearing an olive branch and a freedom fighter's gun. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand." And this means he's come in peace, and do not make him regret his decision of coming into peace. And that's really the emergence of the PLO with some background info about Arabism and Zionism. Some key causes of the Six-Day War of 1967 was the change of government in Syria in February 1966. The rise to power of militant Baathists resulted in increasingly hostile rhetoric at the time when already bad Syrian-Israeli border relations were deteriorating. Conflict embarked in August of 1966 when Israel and Syria clashed in the fierce battle in the area of the Sea of Galilee. Another cause was the Syrian and Egyptian Pact of November of 1966. The Defense Pact boosted Syria's confidence, and both Syria and Egypt continued Fedayeen operations against Israel from Jordan. This increased Israel's threat perception, which made Israel adopt a more hard-line security response. Consequently, Israel launched its most extensive operation since the Sinai campaign, when the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, raided the West Bank villages of Asamu, Jimbah, and Kirbet Karkeh. Another key cause is the Israeli-Syrian air clash of 1967. Israel and Syria engaged in an air battle over Syria, in which Syria lost 6 MiGs. The conflict added the tensions, and an all-out military confrontation seemed almost unavoidable. The false Soviet intelligence report of 1967 was also a key cause. The Soviet President Nikolai Podgorny told Nasser's aide Anwar Sadat that the Israeli troops had mobilized and intended to invade Syria, yet this was inaccurate information. However, given the defense pact of Syria and Egypt, Nasser decided to act immediately. On May 14th, Egyptian troops moved into Syria. The United Nations Emergency Force, or the UNEF, was asked to withdraw. Yet Youth Fans' insistence on either no withdrawal or complete withdrawal left the Egyptian-Israeli border without buffer. Another key cause is the blockade of the Straits. Nasser pretended to close the straits, later claiming that he had no choice if he wanted to return things the way they were in 1956. Nasser did not believe that his action would lead to war. Rather, he would gain a political victory and deflect Arab criticism. The Egyptian-Jordanian Defense Pact was another key cause of the war. Egypt's aggressive intent was confirmed when Jordan joined the general mobilization, followed by the signing of the Mutual Defense Agreement with Egypt in May 30th of 1967. By that point, Israel too had started to mobilize, with the overall result of 80,000 Egyptian troops and 900 tanks, 300 Syrian tanks, 300 Jordanian tanks, and some 250,000 Israeli troops, 1,093 tanks, and 203 planes ready for action. War seemed inevitable. The last main cause of the war was bad diplomacy. Israeli public anxiety and frustration increased while diplomats tried to defuse the crisis. Israeli attempts to negotiate the opening of the straits with Egyptian Vice President Zachariah Moudahin in Washington on June 3rd failed due to increasingly hostile rhetoric from all belligerents. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol was forced to hand over the defense portfolio to the Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, who then took the decision to go to war. It was clear that if Israel did not strike fast, the Arabs would. So the outline of the war On June 5th of 1967, Israel launched a preemptive attack, and the Israel Air Force destroyed 304 Egyptian, 53 Syrian, and 28 Jordan aircraft, mostly on the ground. The IDF crossed into the Sinai and into the West Bank. Syria, Jordan, and Egypt counterattacked the same day, and the three Arab states became embroiled into the land battle with the Jewish state, which continued until June 10th. The Battle of the West Bank ended when Israel captured East Jerusalem on June 7th of 1967, and troops moved to the Jordan River before King Hussein of Jordan agreed to cease fire later in the day. Syrian-Israeli fighting did not even start until June 9th, yet shortly after the 9th, Syria, which had contributed so much to the crisis and nothing to the conflict, also agreed to cease fire. The war with Egypt ended when Israel forces occupied Sharm el-Sheikh and reached the Suez Canal. Having lost 2,000 soldiers in the fighting with Israel and another 10,000 in the retreat, Egypt had no choice but to agree to cease fire on June 8th of 1967. The war left Israel in control of Jordan's West Banks, Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, and the Gaza Strip. The Syria Golden Heights, Israel's air superiority was the most important factor in Israel's victory, followed closely by the lack of Arab coordination, which enabled Israel to deal separately with Egypt, Jordan, and Syria rather than having to fight a genuine three-fronted war. Some consequences of 1967 was that Israel emerged from the war victorious and had increased its territory threefold and became a dominant power in the region. Nasser had been resoundingly defeated and was no longer considered as the main threat, and Nasser saw his claim to leadership of the Arab would be greatly reduced. The more radical Ba'ath regime in Syria started to emerge as Israel's main regional rival, ultimately resulting in the Syrian-Israeli arms race, which in turn provided opportunity for greater superpower involvement. The prestige of the Soviet Union as Egypt's and Syria's ally had been damaged, while the United States started to see Israel as a vulnerable asset to the region throughout which the counter-Soviet influence. Pan-Arabism started to decline, and the Israeli victory contributed to the refocusing on particularistic Palestinian nationalism, as well as placing the Palestinians back on the international agenda. The Six-Day War also provided the international community once again with the opportunity to attempt the conclusion of a regional settlement. The result of the numerous sessions was UN Security Council Resolution 242, which emphasized the inadmissibility of the acquisition of the territory by war and acknowledged the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries free from acts of force. That was a direct quote from Resolution 222. Resolution 242 embodied all of those elements which had been addressed for the conflict resolution: recognition, inadmissibility of acquiring territory by war, freedom from acts of force, peace, and the Palestinian refugee problem. The Arabs insisted that the 242 called the Israel to withdraw from all territories, while Israel insisted it had to hold on to some territories in order to live within secure boundaries. This created further division between Israel and the Arab states on how to proceed. Opposition to territorial compromise was only expressed by the Israel Party Haaret and the National Religious Party. Quote, the Israelis seemed increasingly reluctant to accept a formula which would require their complete withdrawal from territories occupied in war, even if their objectives of secure frontiers, non-belligerency, and freedom of navigation were conceded. End quote. The Arab Summit in Khartoum in September of 1967 decided the debate in favor of the hardliners, with advocated a continuation of the conflict in order to liberate all of Palestine. No peace with, no recognition of, and no negotiation with Israel. This has been a summary of the Six-Day War of 1967, the causes, the course, and the consequences.
Role of the United States USSR, and UNO from 1973 to 1977. Role of the U.S. and the USSR. Both the U.S. and the USSR had a lot of influence in this conflict. The 1956 Suez-Sinai Campaign. The U.S. stopped the campaign because they believed that a full-scale war would result in Soviet intervention in the Middle East. The USSR supported Egypt with arms, Czech arms dealers. Six-Day War from 1967. The USSR and Soviet intelligence gives a false report to Egypt that Israeli troops are mobilizing in the Sinai. This in turn makes Egypt mobilize and eventually both nations go to war. Historians debate over why the USSR issued the report. Some say that the report was a mistake in contrast to others who argue that the USSR deliberately issued the report to provoke a war and start up the Cold War in the Middle East. The 1973 War. The U.S. did not involve in this war because, one, it did not want to antagonize one side as the aggressor, and two, Kissinger received a letter from Sadat that this was just a living war and that Egypt only intended to retake the land they had lost in the Six-Day War. The USSR threatened to intervene in the conflict, and this made both sides stop fighting. The Egyptian-Israeli peace process after the 1973 and onwards. The USSR and the U.S. meet in 1973 in Geneva for peace talks and tried to solve the conflict, but failed. The American Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, emerged as one of the key figures promoting peace in the Middle East. Kissinger undertook a series of visits called shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East to persuade Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories in the 1973 war. The results of his shuttle diplomacy are that Israel gradually withdrew from the Suez Canal, Golan Heights, Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. The UN had also had a hand in the peace process. The UN Security Council decided to hold a debate on the Palestinian question and invited Arafat to speak on the UN on behalf of the PLO. However, this had a negative impact on the peace negotiations as Israelis became furious with the UN. Despite Israeli discontent, the UN subsequently passed two resolutions on the crisis in the Middle East. The first resolution was the 3236 resolution, which reaffirms the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination. The second resolution, the 3237 resolution, invites the PLO into the peace process concerning the Arab-Israeli conflict. This result is more Israeli anger, but the Palestinians have been internationally recognized, and the Palestinian question was on the international agenda for the first time since 1948. American President Jimmy Carter set up a Camp David Accords as he wanted to reconvene the stalled Geneva conferences as they started by Kissinger and intended to solve the conflict. In the Geneva conference, all sides were invited to solve the conflict, and the USSR was a mediator. The Camp David Accords led to improvements in the relationships between the Arab states and Israel. But these talks failed as well due to several factors. For example, in 1977, the right-wing politician Menachem Begin and his right-wing party, Likud Party, when they raised Israel elections and began to advocate for a tougher foreign policy against Arab states and Palestinians. Begin's victory was a major setback for the peace negotiations and led eventually to the failures as Israel became unwilling to compromise in the negotiations with its enemies. The role of the United Nations. The British handed over the problems and the issues to the UN when they withdrew from Palestine. The United Nations Special Committee on Palestine was set up in 1941 to solve the conflict. The UNSCOP saw the partition plan to divide Palestine into two separate states was the only solution to the conflict. However, there were several problems with the plan. The Arabs believed that the committee was biased. They believed it favored Israel. Territorial fragmentation of the states, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were not connected. 3. The Palestinians felt trapped in the Jewish state. 4. The two sides did not receive land proportion to their population. 5. The Zionists did not like the idea of Jerusalem being an international city. 6. The Palestinians and the Israelis both believed the territorial partition was necessary, but economic unity should be retained. The partition plan did not succeed to solve the problem because of the flaws of the plan and other factors. In 1948, a Jewish agency declared its allotted territory the State of Israel. War broke out the next day between Israel and the Palestinians/Arabs. In many ways, the partition plan can be seen as a crucial factor in setting up the conditions for instability and conflicts in the region.